From the Toronto Star, I'm Shone, and this matters.
Now that we're home all the time, it's funny how you pick up on things that maybe were always there and you just never noticed before because you weren't around.
This is Matthew Braga. He writes about technology, science, and culture, and most recently, he wrote a story in The Local, an independent magazine in Toronto. It's about noise and sound, which are just things you learn to live with in a city, especially if you're now working from home.
We hear way more of our neighbors, than we ever heard before. Mysterious sort of banging that happens throughout the day. A lot more footsteps than in previous times. We think maybe our upstairs neighbors have a puppy now.
For me, it's daily. I live on a busy street in the west end of Toronto's downtown. And every day and every few minutes, a TTC bus or a car rumbles by, which generally wouldn't be that bad. But all those sounds get picked up by the mic I'm talking to you on. And that gets real old real fast. But that's just my life. Wherever you live, you have some version of noise that gets distracting or annoying. A car horn, sirens blaring, your neighbor's dog barking all day long. Even as the world got quieter, we noticed plenty.
People basically found that there were actually demonstrable decreases in sound in major cities around the world, and they had these audio files that you could actually hear the difference of what London sounded like a year ago versus London in March, or what Barcelona sounded like a year ago versus Barcelona in March. And the differences really, really are stark.
As Matt writes, noise in a city is complicated. Who hears the most of it? What's good noise and what's bad noise? Who even gets to decide what's considered good and bad? The answers to those questions are rooted in a deep history, and it has everything to do with power, race, class, and control. We're talking about how noise shapes this city, and every city, really. What do the sounds of where we live tell us about how we live?
So it was kind of comforting to know that, it wasn't just me, it wasn't just anecdotal. There's actually data to back up the fact that as cities around the world grounded to a halt, there was absolutely a marked decrease in the amount of sound.
Yeah, and I think inevitably, anyone who lives in a city or spends a lot of time here starts to ask, what if it was this quiet all the time? And in your piece for The Local, you ask, I think, a really interesting question, which is, quiet for whom? And what path did asking that question about Toronto lead you?
It was a much more complex and nuanced answer, I think, than perhaps I realized going in. So one of the entry points, I think, for the story is something that a lot of people can identify with, which is, the leaf blower that you hear your neighbor using, or the dog barking in the apartment above you, or, the streetcars kind of rumbling by, like these sort of really intrusive, annoying, sort of disturbing sounds that really kind of mess with your quality of life. And I think once I started looking into how we think of sound, how we think even of sound complaints, right? The sorts of sounds that you can complain about, what the city will respond to, what they can't respond to, you start to realize that there are different types of sound, there are different types of sources of sound, and the way we deal with those sounds changes quite a bit depending on, the type of sound and where you are in the city. Early on, I think I was interested in sort of getting data on where, the most complaints came from, what parts of the city, what types of complaints. Wasn't able to get that data in the end. I'm sure if I filed an access to information request, I could get that. But one of the things I think that I found really interesting as I was reporting this out is what I thought was originally going to be more of a story about those individual complaints, people having issues with neighbors and nearby businesses or patios or festivals and things like that. That was certainly part of the story, but I was also really taken by this other aspect that I hadn't thought of before, which is what some people refer to as background or environmental noise. So there's the stuff that you can hear very clearly because it's intrusive and it's not there, and then suddenly it's there. But then there's also sort of these noises and these sources of sound that we often just learn to filter out over the course of our lives, right? So somebody living near an airport, after a while, you might not even notice the airplanes flying over multiple times a day, at least in the before time, right? Or if you live near a major highway, you might not even notice the sound of the cars in a way that someone who doesn't live next to the highway would suddenly go, oh gosh, what's that sound? And so exploring sort of how people handle and deal with those types of sounds, if they even think of them at all, became a really interesting part of that question of, well, when we talk about quiet, I mean, what sort of quiet are we talking about? Where in the city? Quiet from what types of sounds? Are there some types of sounds that we value more than others? I mean, these are all really tricky questions to answer easily.
Yeah, and it's almost like an entry point into how we think about class and health. And your piece really explores a lot of these things. You know, when we differentiate background noise, as we call it, and then that chronic long-term noise that we hear all the time, how does that affect our health, actually?
So when we think about sounds that are the most intrusive to us, right? Again, going back to the sounds of neighbors and sort of the sounds of the city, those are definitely annoying and they're frustrating and they can affect your sleep and your quality of life, etc. But one of the things that researchers have found increasing evidence for over the years is, we can refer to sort of those sounds as sort of temporal sounds, right? They're there and then they're gone. They're not maybe there all the time. But you have researchers who are really interested in sort of the sounds that are constantly there, right? Again, those sounds that we don't even begin to notice because we filter them out, but they're always there and they essentially raise the noise floor, right? And so what researchers have looked at over the years is, well, what's the effect of that, right? Is there a different effect on health when you are exposed to a higher level of noise all the time, all day, every day, for years and years and years, right? People like to point out sort of construction, right, as being something that is really, I think, frustrating and sort of debilitating when you talk about quality of life. And absolutely, right, I don't want to discount that at all because I'm sure that's absolutely the case. And when you are in it, it is the worst thing in the world. But the idea with construction, right, is it does eventually end, right? It maybe goes on for a couple of weeks, a couple of months, maybe a couple of years when you're talking about sort of big projects, right, like the Eglinton Crosstown. But there is eventually an end date. And so what researchers are interested in is, well, what happens when there is no end date, right? What happens when you live next to a highway for 20 years? What happens when you live next to an airport for 30 years? What happens when every single night you're always hearing the same sounds from subways or streetcars or buses? And so what researchers have found over the years is that there are actually demonstrable changes to people's ability to operate sort of cognitively, so your ability to concentrate, your ability to recall, memory recall, for example. So there's memory impacts, performance impacts, cognitive impacts on being exposed to that over a long period of time, and then also physical impacts as well, where there have been studies that have found links between harmful levels of sound exposure over time and things like cardiovascular effects, mental effects, effects on blood pressure, for example. And so as a result, I think people are starting to think about, well, hang on a second. Like when we think about noise, it's not so much about how we eliminate noise, but how we can reduce the amount of harmful noise that people are experiencing or people are subjected to if we know that that noise causes health effects like these.
And the researchers that you spoke to at Ryerson and at U of T, they also found that quite often it's people who are poor, people who are people of color, marginalized communities. They're oftentimes the ones who are subjected to the most kinds of chronic noise or the loudest kinds of chronic noise. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, so this is Toro Amo at Ryerson University. He's a researcher and a professor there. He's done a bunch of sound studies on behalf of the city and with the city. And, when we were talking, at one point he said they had created back in 2017 this map of sound across the city. They had deployed sound readers and essentially microphones to measure sound throughout the city. And when they looked at the places that were the loudest, during the day and during the night, you could see sort of these hot spots kind of appear on that map of the city. And he said, if you were to overlay a sort of socioeconomic map of the city, right, where the city's poorest residents live, where the city's most marginalized residents live, people of color in the city, you can see a very close correlation between sort of the heightened sound readings and where those people in the city are living. And I found that really interesting because when you talk about noise, it's not just noise you're talking about. You're also talking about, as you say, issues of race, issues of class, also sort of the health effects as well. I mean, you can't sort of solve noise without really kind of thinking about the underlying ways in which we think about city planning, the ways in which we think about transit planning, the ways in which we think about where we build housing, what type of housing, is it affordable housing, etc. It's all kind of linked. And so this is kind of what I meant earlier on when I said this was sort of a more nuanced and complex question when we ask quiet for whom, because when you start to think about, okay, how do we make the city quieter? How do we make it less loud or at least less harmful sound levels? You also have to start thinking about things like underlying health effects and who is most affected and where those people are most affected, and on and on and on.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about that map too, because especially during the pandemic, I think it's exposed a lot of the inequities that happen in our city, that happen in our society. And when you talk about, there are certain communities that are exposed to louder sounds, more chronic sounds. In some ways, it's sort of like seeing the COVID map and how there are certain communities in Toronto, again, usually mostly people of color, usually lower income, that are disproportionately affected. And it's sort of the same with sound too.
Yeah, again, I mean, it's all connected, right? When you look at sort of the ways in which sort of noise and health and class and race are all kind of tangled together, it's absolutely related. One of the things that Tor Oemo at Ryerson had mentioned, which I thought was interesting, this was in a report that he did on noise for the city, and it noted that, lower income areas were 11 times more likely to experience excessive or harmful levels of nighttime noise than other areas of the city. And that's wild, right? The fact that the amount of noise that you experience can change so drastically depending on where you live in the city. I mean, on the one hand, I guess makes sense. You'd expect that sound would be higher if you were near, let's say, an airport or a road than others. But I mean, it's just such a stark difference that I found that really surprising.
We'll be right back. Reading your piece, too, I was really interested in this one section where you talk about the history of the war on noise and how it started in the city. I know you weren't alive then, but do we have any idea about what Toronto sounded like, 70, 80 years ago? Where did this even begin?
In the 1920s and 1930s, it's really fascinating diving through the Toronto Star archives and other sort of city paper archives in the city, because you get a sense of a city that's really struggling with density, with, massive development, with gentrification, and sort of the struggles of new technologies like automobiles, right, and public transit. And so you have all these stories where people are saying, oh my goodness, the milkmen who drive down the street on the cobblestones, their cars make so much noise. You hear the milk cans clattering around as they go around the city. Or you have all these people complaining about the sounds that streetcars make, which some things never change, right? That's still a problem today that people have. But horns, I mean, even just thinking of the ways in which people drive cars differently back then than today. I mean, there was one particular story that talked specifically about how, I guess, people in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, you would drive up to someone's house and you wouldn't ring a doorbell. You wouldn't get out. You would just honk your horn until they came out of the house. And so there was a Toronto Star story that specifically called out behavior like that, which was really, really interesting. And so, you read all of these.
What was that word?
Oh, so for cars in particular, I believe they referred to nighttime honking as nocturnal tooting. That was the phrase, I believe, coined by a University of Toronto professor named G.A. Anderson. And all of these stories he's described as the noise professor. I guess that was his sort of shtick, and spent the 20s and the 30s kind of raising the specter of cities are getting louder. It's driving people insane. Men will become, infertile. They won't be able to have children because the city is too noisy. It's quite something. And so there were all of these efforts made to essentially introduce bylaws that would outlaw everything from shouting and honking and bell ringing. In some cases, there was I think, desire to use sound bylaws that were then introduced shortly after to curb protests. It really paints a picture of the shouting, the honking, the bell ringing, limits on old cars and motorcycles having to run in good repair, gramophones with soft needles, just so many different things. And so What's really interesting, I think, about Toronto's approach to sound in the 30s is that they took a lot of very explicit cues from what was happening in New York. Again, this is, I think, a trend, right? We have a lot of envy of the way that U.S. cities do things that goes back decades in many cases, and this is no different, right? You had Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia in New York basically approaching sound as, Lillian basically describes it as this crusade on sound, this war on sound, because Mayor LaGuardia thought that sound was essentially a barometer for social chaos, for moral unrest, that if the city was noisy, it meant that there was a problem with society and the people living in it. And so he really tried to do a lot to curb sound in the city, instituting all of the sort of rules and bylaws and limits we're talking about, right? Trying to sort of curb the sound of people on the street, street vendors and peddlers, people protesting, things like that. Really kind of laying the groundwork, I think, for how a lot of us still think about sound today, right? The idea that there can be sort of good sound and bad sound is, I think, still something that we think about a lot, right? Unnecessary sound or unwanted sound. And it's a really, really interesting way of thinking because I think one of the trade-offs of living in a city is that there's going to be a certain type of sound. There's going to be certain sort of comforts and conveniences that come with living in the city that also produce sound, right? I mean, if we make the city quieter, do we want to get rid of public transit? Do we want to get rid of, there's certain sort of trade-offs that I think folks make, which is why I think you see certain, activists and researchers and people who study sound trying to frame this less about sort of what sound is good and what sound is bad, and more, how can we make sure that we're just not exposing people to harmful levels of sound? Because there's always going to be sound, there's always going to be noise, but how do we make sure that we sort of introduce changes or change the way that we run the city in such a way that less people, hopefully, no people at some point, are exposed to levels of sound that are going to affect their health?
And you make the point too, or perhaps the researcher of U of T talks about how, again, there are issues of who gets to decide what is good sound, what is acceptable sound. You talk about this instance in Vaughan with their Caravana, that it was canceled in 2018, versus the air show. We just let that happen every year. And how that's interesting of who gets to decide that's acceptable noise, this is too much though.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that was something that Lillian Radovac also talked about as well in our conversation is, there's certain types of sound that we've come to accept in the city as being welcome, right? The air show happens every year. It makes a ton of noise. There's certainly people that complain about it, but I don't think that those complaints or those concerns have been enough to really curb that from continuing. She brought up another example, though, and she put it really eloquently, where there was a Caribbean culture and music festival in Vaughan in 2008, Carnival Kingdom, that was canceled due to noise complaints. And she makes a really good point, which is, well, why do some sounds have more value than others, right? Is it because these people were black that they received noise complaints, or was it just because that the event was truly too loud? I mean, if you look at some of the reporting back from them, there's a lot of dispute about whether the event was actually that loud at all for people who were living nearby. And I think it's a really, really good point, right? I mean, when we look at sort of noise complaints and the ability to complain about noise, complain about your neighbors, certainly for some people, it can be sort of just another way to try and police people that you do not like and people who are not like you. And it certainly sort of fits, I think, within ways in which people do that in other ways, right? You call the cops, you can make a noise complaint. It's sort of part of that same toolbox. Another thing that I think is really interesting in the present moment as well is that you have all of these streets now that have either been closed down or devoid of traffic in certainly in much of Canada, but also in much of the US. And what have people been doing over the past couple of months in those streets? There have been massive, widespread protests, right? Basically every day, every week for months now at this point. And there's a really good article in The Atlantic by Kate Wagner that I cite in the local piece that I wrote, where she points out, now that these streets are opened up, on the one hand, you have people saying, oh, great, now we have these streets, there's no cars, they can be really, really quiet, we can have these nice sort of idyllic streets. But then on the other hand, you have people who are taking to those streets and using them for protest and making their voices heard and being very, very loud about it. And so, there's also now this question of, well, if we try to designate sort of streets as quiet places, I mean, what does that do to the right that people have to protest, right? Are we going to see different types of enforcement, different types of crackdowns on unwanted sound as people use these streets in ways that are different than perhaps some people would like to see them used? I think that's a really, really compelling point as well, which is that, when we talk about sort of making our cities quieter and our streets quieter, what does that mean for enforcement on people who have, very legitimate grievances and rights, right to protest, right to make their voices heard? I think it's a really, really compelling point.
So really the sounds of a city, who hears the most of it, who gets to decide what is acceptable sound, what is unacceptable sound. It's really another battleground for power and control in a city, isn't it?
Something I think about a lot lately is how for years, I think people who lived in Toronto and people who visited Toronto used to complain about how, the patio culture here, if you want to sit on a patio at a restaurant or a bar, there's just not as many patios as other cities. And the patios that exist are different in configuration or size than what you see in some other kind of major Canadian and especially US cities. And so I'm so struck by the fact that suddenly during a pandemic, there's patios everywhere, right? Obviously, there's health reasons why we've opened them up, but it's just sort of one of those interesting examples of I think people were always told before that noise was such a big consideration in the granting of patios. And it's interesting how now we've basically made a decision to sort of put that aside for the moment in favor of this. And I don't know, is it really all that bad? It's sort of anecdotal, but I just think it's such an interesting example of how, noise bylaws and sort of our perception of noise can be wielded in such a way to, that's an example of controlling how people sort of spend their time and where they can spend their time outside and how, et cetera. But yeah, I think it's such an interesting example. Even when you think of sort of home ownership and houses in the suburbs, I mean, Kate Wagner mentions this in her piece as well, how for such a long time, right? I mean, people have equated quiet with the suburbs. And for a lot of people who live in the city and own homes, they are also trying to preserve a certain amount of quiet as well for themselves at the expense of others in some cases. But I'm going on a bit of a tangent now.
No, you write a quiet life is a privileged life. I thought that was an interesting point of essentially you get to shield yourself from sound if you have the money, you have the power, you have the control to do it.
Yeah, and in so many ways, right? I mean, certainly in terms of proximity, I mean, you can move to the middle of nowhere, you can move to the suburbs, right? There are certain people who can afford to physically move away from sources of sound. But I think another interesting angle of this as well, and this is something that Lillian and I talked about, is that in the early days of the war on noise, maybe sort of before the 20s and the 30s, buildings were built differently. And so Lillian kind of pointed out how sound went from something to sort of be managed, something to be expected, something to be built for, right? People who would construct buildings and houses, they would build them in such a way that would minimize the sound, whether purposely or just, as a byproduct of the materials they were using at the time. And then, of course, that switched into something that rather should be sort of policed and viewed as sort of a moral failing. And so when you look at today, when you look at the way sort of like houses are built and constructed, there are currently no requirements in the Ontario Building Code, like no sort of binding requirements that houses, apartments, buildings be built in such a way that can try to limit outdoor noise. Certainly that's something that you could put in. Like, again, if you have money and you have time and you have resources, you can make your apartment, your house, your downtown condo, absolutely pin drop quiet. But not everybody can afford to do that. And so when you look at sort of houses and apartments and places that are maybe built less expensively, built cheaply, they're not going to have the same sorts of sound protections in them that other people can afford. And so I think that's another really great example of how if there were some changes made to how those types of bylaws exist or are enforced, right, then can you imagine if we were able to build community housing that was as quiet as what sort of more privileged people can afford to build? I mean, that could go a long way to alleviating adverse health effects for people in some parts of the cities, right? It's just sort of one example.
Yeah, let's talk about some of those changes. We've seen some of the ways our city has transformed a lot in the last few months. You mentioned the patios, we've seen more bike lanes, and in a larger sense, I think it's made us rethink how our city can operate. Things that we always thought, yeah, that can never be done. We did it in a very short amount of time. How do researchers think we can maybe remake our society with sound in mind and with equity in mind, rather than, as it's been termed in a few pieces, pandemic opportunism? How could we possibly do that?
So there's practical things that I think a couple of the folks in the piece that I talked to point out, right? I mean, Toronto, I think last fall, around the time that they revamped the noise byline, also put out this sort of action plan for dealing with environmental noise and background noise. And I say simple, but they're deceivingly simple things you can do, right? Which is rerouting the way that you send sort of freight and trucks and also public transit as well around the city, right? What are ways that we can sort of reshape those transportation routes that maybe minimize the number of people that we're exposing to unwanted levels of sound? I mean, that's a great example of that. There's also sort of proposals or discussions around revamping building code requirements right around buildings, which is what we talked about prior and what Lily and I talked about. There was also a really good point that Tor Oemo at Ryerson made, which is that if we were just to reduce the speed limits in a lot of parts of the cities as well, that would also go a long way to reducing the overall levels of sound, right? I mean, his whole thing, which I thought was really interesting, was rather than sort of thinking about noise as something where we have to make these sort of big kind of sweeping changes, there's a lot of things that we can do relatively easily right now within the frameworks that we have that'll make a big difference. And that was one of them. I think the city of Toronto has a sort of a background or like a research note available that says that the amount of noise that a car traveling at 50 kilometers makes is twice as loud as a car traveling at 30 kilometers an hour. So I mean, if you reduce the speed limit, right, in some areas to 40, even 30, what might that do long term to folks' quality of life, right? Of course, then there's sort of larger, thornier questions about enforcement and, how do you actually kind of make sure that people follow that? But it's a really, really interesting kind of point. Another thing that Kate Wagner points out in her Atlantic piece that I cite is also, because you'd mentioned that idea of sort of pandemic opportunism. And I think the thing that Kate really kind of highlighted, and then also sort of Tor and Lillian highlighted as well, is that it's tempting to sort of look at our current state of things and think, oh gosh, like things are so quiet now, right? And I mentioned this in the piece, right? It's so quiet now. Wouldn't it be tempting if things sounded like that all the time? But one really good example in Kate Wagner's piece was, well, everybody's really enjoying the fact that we have all these bike lanes. Everybody's walking everywhere. There's parts of cities all across North America and beyond that have been turned into really interesting sort of examples of sort of pedestrian first urbanism. But sort of the counterpoint is, well, who actually gets to enjoy that when we make those changes to the city? When you look at the people who, during the pandemic, and throughout the pandemic,
thanks for
now,
This Matters is hosted
not
and
able
produced
to
by me,
home, who
Adrian
still
Shone,
had to go out on the roads to drive, who still had to take public transit.
and mixed
if
by
you start
Sean
to
Patton,
change
and our
the way that
director of
those options
programming
are
is
available,
JP Fozo.
where they're available,
Our show theme
and who they're
music is
available
by
to,
So-Called, and our
what impact
episode
does that
music
have
is by
on
Mike D'Angelis.
marginalized residents?
We want to hear what stories matter to you.
And so I think that's something
Please send us
really,
comments,
really
questions, or
important
ideas
to think
to
about.
Matters at the
We
Star.
can't just suddenly say, oh, well, okay, less cars in the road,
Toronto
but
Star
suddenly
Newsroom
close down our
does at
streets, right?
thestar.com.
That
And don't forget to subscribe to This
consequences.
Matters
I
on
think the
Apple
protest
Podcasts,
example is also a really
Spotify,
good one of that as
wherever you
well.
listen to
Suddenly
your
make
favorite
all our
podcasts.
streets quiet.
Let's talk
what
soon.
does that do to people who are using the streets in which ways that, does that then subject people to sort of more policing and more crackdowns than they might have been subjected to before? So that's why I think when we talk about things that we can do going forward, I think the idea of reducing the amount of unwanted sound, harmful levels of unwanted sound that people are exposed to is a really admirable goal to have, because right now, so many people have noticed sort of the absence of sound. They've noticed the quiet that has descended upon their parts of the city, where they live, their homes, their neighborhoods. And I think it's tempting to look at that and sort of think, well, yeah, what if this was like this for me all the time? But I think a better way of thinking about it is, well, using that as a jumping off point for, it's really quiet for me, but is it like this for everybody else in the city? And in a lot of cases, that answer is no. And so how can we kind of use that newfound sort of awareness of, wow, not everybody experiences the same levels of sound in the same ways. Using that as sort of a jumping board, I think, to think about this problem could be a nice, if we can talk about sort of nice outcomes out of the pandemic, hopefully that could be one of them. And that's sort of the way that I had been thinking about this story as I was writing about it is, this has made me think about sound, I think, in different ways than I did before. And that's kind of cool.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Adrian.
That's Matthew Braga, freelance writer on technology, science, and culture. We got this idea for a conversation about how we shape noise and how noise shapes us, especially in a city, especially during this weird pandemic time, from Matt's story in The Local about this very idea. You can find that story online at thelocal.to. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.